In this step, let's look at Jakarta context and dependency injection. This is also called CDI. This is a specification which is part of Jakarta EE, and Spring Framework supports this. Spring Framework V1 was released in 2004. CDI specification was introduced into Java EE 6 platform in December 2009. This is now called Jakarta context and dependency injection. CDI is a specification, it's an interface. There is no implementation that is present in CDI. Spring Framework implements CDI. As part of CDI, there are a few important API annotations which are defined. For example, inject, named, qualifier, scope, and singleton. These are all supported by Spring Framework as well. Inject is very similar to AutoWired. Named is very similar to component. Qualifier, scope, and singleton are very similar to corresponding annotations with the same names in Spring. Let's now see an example where we'll make use of CDI. Now, one of the important things to do is to make use of CDI, we need to add a dependency to our pom.xml. So I'll go into my pom.xml and add a very simple dependency in. So let's go beneath Spring Boot Starter and let's add this dependency in. So we are adding a dependency with group ID jakarta.inject, artifact ID jakarta.inject-API, and version is 2.0.1. So if I save this, you would see that the dependency would now be downloaded. So make sure that you get the group ID, artifact ID, and version right. It's jakarta.inject, jakarta.inject-API, and 2.0.1. Once you add the dependency in, we can start writing code making use of the CDI annotations. So as usual, I'll copy examples A0, do a Control V, and let's over here say G1. So com in 28 minutes learn Spring Framework examples G1, and I'll rename the launcher. Rename. So I'll say CDI context launcher application. Let's say finish and launch this up. So let's say I have a business service which is making use of a data service. So I have a class business service which has a dependency on a data service. So data service, and let's say I have a setter method in here. So I'll go ahead and generate a getter and setter for data service and say generate. And let's make this private, and let's also create the class data service in here. Now let's use setter injection. So this would be at AutoWired usually, right? So this is how setter injection works, and this is where we would put at component, and this is where we would have data service. If I do a organize imports, you would see that org Spring Framework stereotype component is imported in, and for AutoWired it's org Spring Framework beans factory annotation AutoWired is imported in. And if I do a sysout in here, I can see that setter injection would be performed. So if I go ahead and run this right now, so what you'd see is that the business service data service are printed and injection is done using setter injection. And if I do a sysout, and if I do a sysout of context dot get bean business service dot class dot get data service, what would happen? Let's format this and run it again. You're seeing null being printed in here. You're seeing null being printed. Why am I seeing null? The reason I'm seeing null is because I have put AutoWired on the wrong method. It should not be on the get method. It should actually be on the set method. So let's change that code and put it above. So on the set method, we have auto-wired. Let's now fix this, run as Java application. Okay, now you have the data service being printed in here. So we are making use of setter injection and we have the data service being printed. So now we have the data service being printed in here. Let's also move setter injection above. And now let's go ahead and run this. Cool. Now you'd see that setter injection happens and we are able to inject in the data service. Now CDI is just an alternative. Instead of using at component, what you can do is you can say at named. So at named and organize imports, you can see that Jakarta inject named is what is coming in. And if I hover over there, you can see that named, and instead of auto-wired, you can use at inject. If you do an organize imports, you can see that Jakarta inject is coming in. And over here, I can replace at component with at named as well. So organize imports. Let's go ahead and run this right now. And you'd see that the data service is auto-wired in, and you'd also see that setter injection has happened. So what we are seeing in here is the fact that the CDI annotations or the context and dependency injection annotations are nothing but alternatives to Spring annotations. You don't really need to use them, but it's good to be aware of them. So named is a replacement for component. Inject is a replacement for auto-wired. In this step, we talked about CDI, context and dependency injection. This is just a specification defining a set of annotations. These annotations can be used to perform dependency injection. The great thing is Spring Framework also implements CDI. So it supports the CDI annotations. In this step, we looked at examples of inject and named. Inject is very, very similar to auto-wired in Spring, and named is very, very similar to component in Spring Framework. I'm sure you're having a wonderful time, and I'll see you in the next step.